Hey, good morning, guys. This is Loma02. I kind of wanted to share some vintage content to kind of change it up. So, the deck you have in front of you is Paradoxical Outcome Storm. It's my build of it. This is a grixis version, rather, of the deck. I think a lot more of the versions have gone Esper, and then I think some of the newest versions are leaning a little more towards it being in red for Experimental Frenzy. It's not a card. I think it's a card. It's an engine card. So if you're not familiar with Experimental Frenzy, I actually do not own that card yet, but I can describe it. So CMC 3, 1 red, so 4 combined mana cost of 4. It is an enchantment, and it says you may play cards from the top of your deck. You may not play cards from your hand. And pay its converted mana cost again, red 3, destroy Experimental Frenzy, which would allow you to play cards from your hand again. I think the card's very powerful, but being at 4 is a pretty huge bar to entry in Vintage. I think the card will eventually find a home in some sort of engine-style deck, but I think it's going to be very hyper-focused. It does have a fissile rate, but it's not an exceedingly high fissile rate. The issue you run into is like a lot of the... Look at this deck right here. I'll go through kind of how it broken down, but the 21 pile or the second pile from the left-hand side as you look at the screen is all card draw. Some of it is selection, but it's selection that is pretty much hyper-focused on getting more card draw. So like when you look at cards like Merchant Scroll and Demonic Tutor, yeah, they're not card draw in a traditional sense, but they're probably going for another card on the 21 pile, or the DT can also go for the Tendrils. It's like kind of the other thing, which is the sole win con of this deck, outside of like trying to mill someone, I guess. Like, probably not feasible. This deck will mill itself first. So that aside, Experimental Frenzy is kind of a bigger thing now. Esper was a bigger thing. I've been out of the Vintage game for like 3 or 4 months. Like I haven't been playing much Magic at all. And I kind of wanted to play some recently. I probably played 4 or 5 games. I played, I believe, 2 games with Paradoxical Outcome Storm. Since I've been back, then I think I played a couple Oath matches. Actually, I probably played 6 or 7. Think of it. I have some Jeskai time. I've got some Oath time, and I've got some Storm time since I've been back in the Vintage. I haven't played the shops yet, but I don't really want to go back to playing shops. I'm just going to play Modern. Anyway, so this is the deck. This is kind of I think a slightly older take on this deck, on this Paradoxical Outcome deck. I believe it is far more powerful than like the Esper versions of the deck were, but I think it is far less resilient. So when I say that, I mean like Kimball is a big issue for this deck. This deck's interaction level is very low. So the philosophy behind this deck, and as you go over into these piles that I'm highlighting right now, this is the deck's interaction. It has Force of Will, it has Chain of Vapor, and it has 2 Defense Grids main deck. That's it. The philosophy behind this deck is that you can use cards like Chromox over here to put useless Force of Wills or Chain of Vapors underneath the Chromoxin, so that these cards right here are interaction that is colored can become mana. So the only true dead cards, if you're not playing against any counter spells whatsoever, which basically means you're playing against shops or... basically shops. Even Dredge plays counter Magic now. Generally speaking, Pitch Dredge does. Defense Grid's generally not useless in any matchup, with the exception of like stacks, shops, workshops-based decks. But all the other interaction that you have can turn into mana at some point in the game. So this deck is essentially a lot faster. It'll fish a lot faster. It's a very, very powerful deck because it is completely focused on mana production in this first pile, which is my 31 cards, and then card draw. And some of this card draw, I mean, is pretty standard, restricted Vintage card draw. You have like, your Wheels of Fortune, your Yawgmoth's Will, your Time Twister, your Tinker, which I put Tinker in the card draw pile because Tinker, other than Defense Grid or Black Lotus, pretty much exclusively goes for Memory Jar. Memory Jar is the ideal card to get. If you're going for a Defense Grid, you're probably winning as well. If you're going for a Black Lotus, you're trying to win. If you're going for Memory Jar and it's working, you're going to win probably. If you're getting a Defense Grid, if that's like the line you've committed yourself to is getting a Defense Grid with it, it probably means you have enough mana. It probably means you made that decision because you have enough mana to do something else to draw the deck. The philosophy behind these decks, if you've never seen one played or never played a Vintage Paradoxical Outcome deck, is that your artifact can transmute into cards. It's very mutable because most of your mana is in the form of artifacts. It makes this deck, a little bit prone. Well, it is powerful, very prone to certain cards. So, like Stony Silence just, Stone Cold kills this deck. No Rod can Stone Cold kill this deck. That's why you'll see we have like a Chain of Vapor in the main deck. and we have Force of Wills to stop it on the stack, ideally. This is probably one of the faster decks, like one of the most consistent fast decks I've played. Like, as far as turn 1 kills, turn 2 kills, this deck's there. I mean, I don't know what the what the percentage of it is to fish on turn 1, but it's pretty high. Like, I put my money on it that if I just went into the play lobby right now and opened up a game and fished it, I'm going to get a turn 1 to turn 2 kill if I keep a reasonable hand. I don't have to mulligan into Oblivion. But we'll show you a game relatively soon here. Going into the sideboard, because the deck itself is simple. I mean, this is all mana. You just have a pretty, standard small actual land package in this deck, which is one of the downsides to it, vice a deck like the Esper version. The Esper version runs a lot more lands and less artifacts. But that also has its trade-offs. So while it makes that deck far more resilient against shops, it also makes it less consistent at effectively going nuclear, so to speak, because in a way, Storm is kind of like a nuclear reaction. Like, I mean, I would say this deck is probably like 2/3 critical. Well, like the blue-white black version, the Esper version, is probably about like 50% critical or something like that, just from starting poise, from the starting gate, and just how the deck's built. But that all said, I mean, this is obviously less resilient because, like, I have 31 mana sources. I believe 11 of which are actual lands, or that might be less, maybe 9. I'm going to count them now. Yeah, 9 lands. So 9 lands out of 31 mana sources. So most of our mana is coming out of artifacts. So, like, there are a couple cards that can just stone cold kill us. But that said, I think the trade-off is generally worth it, because if they have to mulligan into those answers and you have Force of Will, you're generally going to stop them. If they keep a hand that's... Like, there's no deck that's more aggressive than this deck is. Like, if Stacks just had an aggressive draw with no interaction, they're not going to be faster than this. It's just nothing's really quicker than Storm is in Vintage, unless they can stop it. That's what makes them quicker, is like they get a Null Rod down, or they get a Chalice the Void down on 0 or something like that. It's going to allow them to actually win. So that is kind of the deck. It is basically, like I said, a nuclear reaction. It's built to be the most efficient that it possibly can be, and have the best cards at what it does, which is draw the deck, eventually get to your Tendrils win con, and then just kill them with it. And like I said, it's fairly narrow. It's fairly easy to hate out. But I also think this deck has enough resilience. And like, if you've watched enough of my videos, you know that I am not a big fan of like complete glass cannons. This deck is more on the side of being a glass cannon. I won't disagree with that. It's very narrow and very focused on how it wins. But it does offer a lot of interesting decision trees that are very fun to go through. And it does still have interaction. It has Force of Will. Like, Force of Will tends to be, like, for me, if I'm playing Vintage or Legacy, like, I tend to want to play it. Like, I just like playing Force of Will. It's not that I like enjoy the act of countering spells, but I like the insurance policy that Force of Will gives you. There's some things it doesn't give you an insurance policy against, like, Dredge, but, like, most of the time, like, if you can buy a turn with this deck, it's generally enough, and that's all you really need. You don't need to counter spells all day, but if you can get the right spell one time and get the turn pass back to you, generally you can win with the deck. So that's kind of like one of the things that I still get fun out of playing this deck, even though it is a pretty hyper-focused combo deck. Jumping into the sideboard, you have another Chain of Vapor here because, like I said, Kimball is an issue, Stony Silence, Null Rod. There are quite a few problem cards for this deck. It could even be Witchbane Orb or something along those lines. 2 Flusterstorm, really for the mirror. You find the mirror a lot because Paradoxical Outcome's a pretty common deck. It's probably some variation of Paradoxical Outcome is probably the best deck in Vintage, to be honest. Not even to be honest. It likely is. Does it get beat from time to time? Yes. I mean, Vintage is very powerful. Like, all the decks are very powerful. And sometimes, you're just going to get beat because, your shop's opponent's going to have an ideal opener. They're going to drop Mishra's Workshop, Black Lotus, and then, like, dump a bunch of spheres, and you're just locked out of the game. Hercule's Recall, 2 of those because, shops is a thing, and sometimes, they're going to get out ahead. They're going to get the die roll in the first game. They're going to get out ahead, and, you're going to have to, if you win game 2 on the play, you're going to have to... game 3 win a game on the draw, which means Hercule's Recall is going to be important in the boarded matchups, but specifically your game 3 against shops if you lose the first game. Mindbreak Trap, just against all variations of like just speed combo decks, basically in the mirror again, like Mirror of Swords. Toxic Deluge, kind of a concession. Like, there are some creature-based decks. There's like the Survival deck now, which I've been seeing, which is kind of an interesting deck. I don't really think it's great against this deck though. There's shops, then there's like the Camball, Mentor sort of matchups. Toxic Deluge is actually a better card than, like, I don't probably sideboard it in as much as I should. But I do like having it as an insurance policy against creature-based decks in my sideboard. White Eldrazi, it's also very good against. Pyroblast, Empty the Warrens. Empty the Warrens, I generally tend to sideboard in against, like, I don't think it's bad against White Eldrazi. I don't think it's bad against shops. Basically, it increases the likelihood of getting into a win con to fish out faster than you would if you just had the one win con in your deck. So I don't tend to mind it, but I sideboard it a lot less, than I probably should. Pyroblast, I sideboard in quite a bit, because there's a lot of blue decks in the format, and having one Pyroblast is kind of like a nice, like, you know, hate to say it, but like, F you, you know, like, hey, I got it, you know. Because it's funny, like, I don't think, in general, that Mental Misstep is that great in this matchup, so I think, in general, opponents will tend to sideboard some number of their Mental Missteps out. I mean, if you start looking down, like, my Mental Misstepable pile, you know, it's about 10 cards, but only a couple of them are, like, really crucial. Like, I don't really mind if my preordains are getting Mental Misstepped. Sensei's Divining Top is nice, but I don't care if it gets misstepped. Gataxian Probe, whatever. Ancestral Brainstorm Ponder, you don't want to get those misstepped. Chain of Vapor, if you need it, you don't want it to get Mental Misstep. But oftentimes in, like, unboarded matchups against blue decks or decks that would run Mental Misstep, Chain of Vapor is a stone-cold piece of crap. So you want to toss it underneath a Chrome Mox pretty much as fast as you can, because it's just not going to do anything. Or pitch it to a Force of Will. Remaining part of the sideboard, one island for the shops matchup. They're going to play Wastelands. We only have one basic in the deck, so it generally tends to pay to have one more. Blightsteel Colossus, again, not bad against shops, but you need to be leery of, like, Phyrexian Metamorph. Not bad against certain creature matchups. Like, I do think White Eldrazi has a tough time beating a Blightsteel Colossus on turn 1. Well, actually, I guess if they're running Swords to Plowshares or Path to Exile, they probably don't. It just depends. Are they running Swords to Plowshares? If they're not, or Dak Faden. Like, Blightsteel is very situational for me. Like, when I first started playing this deck, I sideboarded Blightsteel in quite a bit, and now, like, I very rarely sideboard Blightsteel in. Like, I can't remember the last game that, you know, even before I stopped playing for a while, I was sideboarding it in, because it's just like, it's not worth it. Like, it's just better to kill with Storm. Like, I'm more happy with Empty than I am with Blightsteel Colossus, because they basically kill in the same time frame. And then a bunch of Tormod's Crypts. You know, you may think that... So, this deck actually is faster than Dredge. Much faster. Dredge, at best, can kill on turn 2. It can never... Without Lion's Eye Diamond, you know, like, which makes the deck a lot more inconsistent, the deck really can't fish out on turn 1. It just can't. Dredge can't. It can have a lot of good interaction to buy time to get to turn 2 where it can fish out. Not highly reliably, but it can fish out on turn 2. But this deck's just quicker, right? That all said, like, Dredge actually, you know, after sideboarding, tends to run more counter magic than this deck does or can or really wants to. Because I see this deck as being the aggressive deck in the Dredge matchup. I think Dredge has to play control in that matchup because this deck right here can fish quicker than they can. But that all said, like, I do think you still want an insurance policy against their strategy because, you know, let's say they do sideboard into a bunch of counter magic, like a bunch of permission. Well, these Tormod's Crypt are things they have to answer, and if they keep hands that stop your game plan, that's going to stink because you're going to be slowed down and it's probably going to take 4 or 5 turns to kill them. But during that time frame, they're still going to be dredging and, like, dumping stuff in the graveyard, but not really focused on their primary plan. And if you could slip 1 or 2 of these things into the game, well, they're going to be trying to bazaar into hands that are interactive. They're not going to be bazaring into hands that are per se game-winning. They're going to be prevent me from losing hands. And Tormod's Crypt can then limit their graveyard of valuables to keep them from winning after they've expensed their interaction. And then you're going to top deck better because Dredge really doesn't top deck well. I mean, it uses its graveyard as kind of a statistical, you know, it's a paragon of statistical analysis. It's going to win on turn 2 or 3. 3 pretty much guaranteed. 2 maybe, you know. But if you get 1 or 2 Tormod's Crypts down and you can disrupt their graveyard and get some of their more valuable cards out of their deck, if you kind of understand the deck and the matchup, then I think oftentimes, you know, you can buy yourself like 1 to 2 extra turns off of 1 card, which in my opinion tends to be worth it. You know, because it just disrupts them so heavily. So that all said, this is the Paradoxical Outcome deck. I'm going to jump into a game here after a quick pause between this deck and actually an Experimental Frenzy deck. All right, so right back, guys. All right, guys, we're back. So, opening hand. This hand has some issues, but it's not the worst, it's not the best. What does this hand really want to draw? Probably like a Moxen. Well, the best draw for this hand is like pretty easily like a Mana Crypt. But Mana Crypt is like secretly one of the best mana cards in Paradoxical Outcome decks, or maybe not so secretly. It's just awesome in this style of deck because it doesn't need to stay in play pretty much ever. You're just, it makes a boatload of mana. It goes back into your hand, draws you cards. Very, very good. So I see a Mishra's Workshop, and I'm like, uh-oh. But then I'm also like, well, the Chain of Vapor at least is generally templates pretty well against workshop decks. The one problem is I only have a land in hand, and if they play out some spheres, I'm in trouble. But then I see a Mox Opal and a Sensei's Divining Top, and I'm like, oh, well, this is something different then. And I've been out of the Vintage game for a while, so I'm not really sure what I'm facing. My initial thought is I'm facing like 2-card Monty here, like some sort of like Painter's Servant, Grindstone, or Leyline Helm combo deck, like both of them. Like so, 2-card Monty. So I do play on a defense grid here, just to get the card out of my hand. My thinking is, like, they could be a Force of Will deck, but they're probably not a Force of Will deck. If they are, they may actually counter the defense grid, just because they know they're not going to be able to get around it. They don't, so that either means they don't have it or they're not a Force of Will deck. The only issue with playing the defense grid out here, which I think I'm forced to do it, is that they also know that I don't have Force of Will in my hand. So if they're the combo deck, which it appears they're on some sort of combo deck, then they know they're free to go for it next turn. The good thing is they don't have the mana to actually set up their top deck with Sensei's Divining Top, so I think I'm pretty much in the clear. But I think defense grid either way needs to get played. If they're not a Force of Will deck, like I want another permanent in play for Paradoxical Outcome based on my top deck next turn. And again, we're still hoping to top deck Artifact Mana here. We don't really want to use the Polluted Delta, which I'm saving for the Brainstorm right now. If I have to use the Polluted Delta to cast the Paradoxical Outcome, I will next turn. I probably won't like preordain. I may preordain next turn. Actually, you know what? I know myself well enough. I would preordain if I did not hit an piece of Artifact Mana, just to try to find a piece of Artifact Mana. It's just more cards. So pass turn back to him. We see a Forbidden Orchard. So like they have some crazy stuff going on. They likely are either playing Forbidden Orchard to try to beat Oath, or they're playing an Oath game plan themselves. Oath doesn't really scare me on this deck. Oath is actually very slow. It's a slow win con. At a minimum, it takes one whole turn cycle to get a creature into play, and that's assuming you're playing Dragon's Breath. And, at worst, it's 2 turns, to get whatever threat you're getting down to kill me. And 2 turns seems like a very long time to me, so I'm not that scared of it. My opponent is at 4 cards. They do get to look. They find ostensibly a Grim Monolith, or maybe they found some interaction, but they did flip their top there. I find a Mox Ruby, which I'm very happy with, and I'm just going to go for my first Paradoxical Outcome here at 4. Oh, correction. No, I'm not. So actually, I like this play better. I like going with Brainstorm Fetch to get rid of the garbage out of my hand, to include the Chain of Vapor, because there's something that needs to be Chain of Vapored right now. The only use Chain of Vapor seems like it's going to have in this matchup is to be put under a Chrome Mox or pitched to a Force of Will. So I want to get the best cards off the top of my deck. I want to get rid of the junky cards and then Paradoxical Outcome. So actually, I kind of like how I sequence this better than I was explaining. So I go ahead and get an Underground Sea, play out Grim Monolith off of the Sol Ring, and now I'm going to go for a 4-card, 1-mana Paradoxical Outcome. Go ahead and look at their hand. Their hand has Experimental Fury, but it has nothing that can interact on this turn. So I just go ham. Like, this is a go ham turn. And we do. So I just start playing out all the Artifact Mana, make a bunch of mana. I've netted 4 mana at this point. Unfortunately, Tolarian Academy is not going to come into play this game because I've already played my 2 lands. And that is one of the things, kind of get to see in Game 2 is, like, sometimes you won't play lands if you know you're going to wheel or spin your hand. So this is a pretty easy hand to win with. After the first Paradoxical Outcome does resolve, we wheel into more cards. We do find the Mind's Desire. I just run up the Storm count as high. Well, I run up the Storm count to 29 to basically get my whole deck out of itself and flipped upside down in the Exiled Zone. I went a little too ham. I had 4 extra triggers, or not triggers, but I guess cast Storm counts on Mind's Desire. And I just cast Tendrils after resolving the defense grid, just in case I wheeled them into some interaction. Although at this point, with I want to say 2 Force of Wills in the Exiled Zone that can be cast, plus 1 in hand that's castable off of the Chain of Vapor, I'm probably in the clear. Outside of something like, I guess Flusterstorm would do it here. Flusterstorm would do it, but at the point in time Flusterstorm's being cast, and I can cast Time Walk, they're tapped out, and I can dump all the cards out of my Exiled Zone, and do I have it still? Oh, I have Yawgmoth's Will. So yeah, I can basically Yawgmoth's Will this turn if I have to. So if they kill this, I can Yawgmoth's Will and win that way. So there's really, even if they Flusterstorm it, I think, at that point they're tapped out because they're paying 3 off the Grim Monolith plus the blue mana off of the Mox Opal. We still have 2 colored mana sources, one black source available plus an additional white source, which puts us up to 10 mana. Colorless, basically, because white and red mana don't really count. It's still colorless mana, basically, for this deck. 1 black mana, Black Lotus plus LED. This hand really isn't needed. This hand can be pitched because it's junk. It has 1 counter spell in it, is what it has. And then a whole boatload of mana over there. So yeah, we could have Yawgmoth's Will into the win. Anyways, that was game 1 against Experimental Frenzy. One of the things I don't like about these Experimental Frenzy decks, and I get it, people are experimenting with the card right now, no pun intended, or very much intended if you like. They don't seem exceedingly consistent to me. Like, it's just, if they have the nut draw and they have like the mana to get it out, turn 1, they can win turn 1. I just think on their average draw, they're a lot worse than like a pure Paradoxical Outcome deck on its average draw. And they're still playing Paradoxical Outcome, so you're increasing the amount of 4 mana spells in the deck, which to me, it's like, I really don't want to do that. I want to keep my converted mana cost as low to the ground as possible and keep most of the deck about mana and cards, and then have very few ways to win. And I see Experimental Frenzy, at least in this style of build, with Paradoxical Outcome as well. It oftentimes feels like kind of a win more card to me. Maybe it is that like you sideboard it in, or maybe it's like a singleton copy, in a deck against like control. Because it is harder to deal with. Like, it cannot get red elemental blasted. It cannot be Flusterstorms. It basically has to be Force of Willed, or people have to start sideboarding in blue elemental blast to get it. So it's kind of a hard card to deal with once it, even on the stack and when it resolves. Because enchantments just, other than like Oath, really aren't a thing that you often need to worry about. In Vintage, like I'm trying to think of like a good enchantment in Vintage. I mean, like there are some, but they're just not cards you really want to deal with by disenchanting them. Like Yawgmoth's Bargain, like it's already going to have done its job by the time if it resolves, it's doing its job. Like, it doesn't matter if you kill it. Like in response, you're just going to draw a boat of cards and kill and basically win. Necropotence, same thing. Like disenchanting Necropotence never feels good. You're just like, all right, well, I just disenchanted this thing and they drew a bazillion cards, and well, okay, which feels pretty miserable, but. Anyway, that aside, like I have not yet been that impressed by the card. I do think it will probably find a place in the format. I just think at 4 mana, it's an awful lot, and when it's competing with a card like Paradoxical Outcome, I think it's in a tight spot. I think PO is just a better card. Like, that aside, I mean, it does get Flusterstormed, which is a big deal because Flusterstorm is a card folks will bring in against it quite often, but. I think the ability that PO has to not only make cards, because Experimental Fury makes cards, it can kind of make mana too by getting stuff off the top of your deck, but I think it's going to be wholly less consistent because Paradoxical Outcome is based around known factors, not unknown factors, like, oh, am I going to have a chain of Moxen on top of my deck? So I don't know. I'm not sold on it yet. Anyways, next game, guys. Quick pause. We'll be right back. All right, so this one's more interesting. Still a quicker game, but a little more decision-making in this one. So this hand is actually better than the first one, but it is pretty vulnerable to, like, interaction. Now, that all said, I didn't see interaction on my opponent in the first game. Like, I don't figure they probably run much. I figure they're trying to be like a speed combo deck too. But the problem with their speed combo deck is I think its converted mana cost is just higher than my own. So here's this hand. I'm on the draw this time, so I have 0 interaction. I have a Force of Will in hand. I actually don't mind this hand because it has the ability to go turn 1 Tinker into Memory Jar and then draw a whole new hand. The question's going to be when we play this hand is, do we want to exile Yawgmoth's Will and keep our land drop available? So, after I see my draw step, I see another land, and I'm thinking in my head, like, that's kind of interesting to see because, I would have rather had artifact mana, but it's kind of interesting to see another land because now I know 2 lands are going to be out of my deck. I'm a 9-land deck, and the land that would make this hand the most critical, like, to get that nuclear reaction again, would be Tolarian Academy. So what I can do is this. I can play out my Underground Sea, Mox Jet, Chrome Mox, nothing underneath it, Mox Opal, into Mox Opal, float mana off 1 Opal, and cast out a Tinker for Memory Jar. And then if I Thistle on Memory Jar, then I can cast Yawgmoth's Will and recast all the stuff I threw in my graveyard off of the Memory Jar, which is probably a safer line of play, but I like it a little bit less because it gives my opponent more time as well. And they're going to see quite a few cards this turn, and they're going to have 5 by next turn. The other play is I go Mox Jet, Mox Opal, Chrome Mox, imprinting it with Yawgmoth's Will, cast the Tinker for the Memory Jar, play out the other Opal, removing the tapped Opal from play, and I Memory Jar and just go for it. I don't play any lands at all. And that way I leave myself with a land drop accessible, which means that if I hit the Tolarian Academy, I can just win on turn 1. I mean, there are other options for winning turn 1, but Tolarian Academy is probably the most consistent turn 1 win conditions card you most often want to have for turn 1 wins, just because of the raw mana. And I go for it here. I hit the Tendrils of Agony, which is interesting because I do find the T Academy here. So I find the T Academy. Here's the issue with this hand now. I don't quite have enough mana to Merchant Scroll into a Paradoxical Outcome. I know I'm going to lose Tendrils of Agony on my end step here, and it's going to go to my graveyard. And I also know that I've imprinted Yawgmoth's Will, which means that Tendrils of Agony is only accessible to me at this point in the game via Time Twister. So I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be able to win this turn because of kind of how I drew off the jar. I go ahead and get Taxian Probe here to see their hand. They have Helm of Awakening, so they're a Helm of Awakening combo deck. I find Hercule's Recall, put all their artifacts back in their hand, so they discard all of their artifacts, and they're basically just down on artifact count, so PO becomes worthless or less useful. They have a Time Vault and the Grim Monolith, but they don't have a key to kind of exploit it. I look at my top deck. I decided to draw the Vault. The Vault's probably the most valuable in this style of deck. I play my land because I'm just going to play any land now. I kind of get lucky here, so the third card below that pile that we saw initially was Windfall. Windfall is not going to draw me a lot of cards here, but what it will do is it'll get me through 2 cards on top of my deck, get rid of a dead card, the Underground Sea in my hand, and allow me to see further with my top, which is kind of like what I'm going for here. So I basically draw top and draw a card I knew about, and I find that second and third card, Paradoxical Outcome and Soul Ring. Now I'm pretty much at critical. Although I kind of miss, right? So like I don't hit a PO here. I basically just get Sensei's Divining Top and a whole boatload of cards. So I've got half my deck gone at this point. I have seen, I want to say, 2 Paradoxical Outcomes, although one was scrolled away. No, I've only seen 1. So as opposed to the first turn kind of getting the optimal, which would have just been going to a Paradoxical Outcome turn and just make whole tons of mana, we got Hercule's Recall off of a Merchant Scroll, bounced their fast artifact mana, forcing them to discard it from the delayed trigger on Memory Jar at end step. And this turn, had to use a Windfall to essentially get a new look with the Sensei's Divining Top, and find Paradoxical Outcome, found Paradoxical Outcome, kind of drew dead with it, and now, again, we're relying on our top. What you probably didn't see because it went too fast is I did not find the Paradoxical Outcome with my top. What I found was Force of Will, which is sitting on top of my deck right now, and then some other nonsense. So what the plan is here is to let my opponent go, with Force of Will, hard cast is an option for me off of all my mana. On the following turn, take a look and see if the third card down is useful, and if it's not, utilize one of the Polluted Deltas to find the remaining land, or correction, one of the 2 remaining lands it can find, which is either an island or a volcanic island on my next turn. So they play out their Forbidden Orchard again. They go ahead and resolve a Tinker. I have to counter this, it's going to get Voltaic Key and just win my opponent the game. So I do jump for my Force of Will and say, okay, here's the Force of Will. And opponent plays out some artifact mana and just says go. Draw back at the top. I play out my land. I don't fetch yet, obviously. I'm going to take a look. I find Demonic Tutor. Demonic Tutor is good enough, so I draw into it. I fetch because I'm not going to need the top anymore. Draw to PO. And this is game. Like, you know, that a PO that big is pretty much, it's impossible for us statistically to probably miss. So I'll go through the motions here. You can see everything moving exceedingly fast on MTG. I'll guarantee you it wasn't that fast in real life. As you'll see, I'm 4 minutes below my opponent. Part of it's probably because I'm rusty. And secondly, there's a lot of actions to take in these style of Storm decks. There's a lot of little decisions to make and actions. So as you can see, I'm basically doing the same thing I did last game. I'm just flipping my deck upside down, exiling all of it. My opponent's making me go through it this time, more than likely because they want to see how I'm going to get the tendrils back. I go ahead and get as many permanents as I can out of my deck by taking them out of the exile pile and putting them on the board. And I time twister my deck, as I specified kind of earlier, because I had to get rid of the Yawgmoth's Will to put tendrils back in my deck, and then, I draw back into tendrils. I think I had a bazillion Mox Opals and a Demonic Tutor, and I just make a bunch of black mana off Opals, discarding them after I, play a second one or a third one. And then Demonic Tutor for tendrils, find the tendrils, and then just cast tendrils for some, just ridiculous storm count 32. So, not the most elegant win here, but, at the end of the day, it was a win. We lost some valuable goods in the memory jar turn to include the tendrils. Predicated on that, we had a decision where, we had to lose the Yawgmoth's Will itself, or we did lose the Yawgmoth Will itself due to the decision we made to try to hit Tolarian Academy over playing one of our lands. And then our line became pretty direct, pretty forced to have to find Time Twister to put the deck back together. Ideally, with all of the mana already out of the deck, so that basically all we could draw into off of Time Twister was card draw, so that it was a foregone conclusion off of any Time Twister draw 7 that we hit enough cards to find the tendrils after we reassembled the deck. So, that was this game with Paradoxical Outcome Storm, this Grixis version. I forgot how much I love Vintage. This is great. I really love playing this deck. I think it's exceedingly fun. There are some unfun matchups, but playing the Storm Mirrors is not a problem for me. I don't mind playing Storm Mirrors. And actually, I don't mind playing Shops. I don't mind playing anything with the deck. I mean, there are times where, you just get Stone Cold Kill, because, this deck is not as resilient as the blue, the Esper version, the blue, white, black version. But at the end of the day, I do think they trade off a lot of power to gain that resilience against a lot of the other strategies. And I think just the raw power of this deck, it could even beat the decks that are designed to hate it out. It can, because it's so quick. I mean, if you get the die roll, this, like I said, this is one of those decks that, I feel like if I want to just fish, about 40 to 50% of the time I can just win on turn 1. If I wanted to fish, and if they don't have a Force of Will or something like that. So if they're an uninteractive deck, like Shops or something like that, and you have to play, you just gotta put the foot to the floor and go as fast as you can, and generally speaking, you can beat them. And then you have Hercule's Recall, Chain of Vapors to get the specific stuff out of the way if you need to. But very cool deck. Some pretty cool games against opponent Geometris here. Definitely enjoyed them, and I hope you guys did as well. If Vintage is a format that interests you, it's actually relatively cheap online. And I think it's very fun. I'm kind of playing the deck that everyone says, oh, I don't ever want to try to play Vintage because everyone turn 1 kills the Storm and stuff like that in Vintage. And yes, the format can do that. It's one of the things that the format offers. But I still think that decks like this have an important role in the format. They are kind of the boogeymen that try to keep everyone else honest. When I say honest, I mean people are still playing their Wastelands, they're still playing their Force of Wills, the fair cards that make this format, fair, quote unquote. But that all said, this deck still requires a decent bit of decision making. There are some simple, stupid hands where you just win on turn 1 because your hand's just ridiculous. It's just the nuts. And there's a lot of other hands, where you have to go through some interesting decision trees and actually, make some tougher play calls. I think the most interesting call in this game was whether we played land on turn 1 or we did not pre-memory jar. I took the more greedy line for Tolarian Academy. It paid off. I got the Tolarian Academy, but I also had to trade off a potential turn 1 win because I lost my tendrils in the graveyard and knew that I would probably have to spend another turn reassembling the whole deck. As it turned out, I was able to kind of do it on the third turn anyways because I hit the massive mana that I needed. So the game went this way. But still, there are decisions in this deck. It's not just, a point and shoot kind of deck. It's not, it's not all lightning bolts at the end of the day. So anyways, guys, I'm going to go ahead and cut it there. I hope you enjoyed this vintage content on Grixis Paradoxical Outcome and or Storm in Type 1. Well, I guess Vintage. I'm sorry, Vintage. All right, guys, take care now and enjoy.